There's this long track record of him talking about how he doesn't have this strong sense of self. And I think that this is a crucial autistic trait that outside observers, when they say that this isn't a portrayal of autism, are missing.
Welcome to It's Just ADHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments, and how to make the best of life with ADHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tara, and I have a late-in-life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just ADHD.
All right, welcome back to It's Just ADHD, where we break down the science oftentimes and just have deep conversations around neurodivergent experiences, especially representations in pop culture. And so today is a little bit of a different episode because we're talking about pop culture a little bit. It's also funny, like, I feel like most of our episodes were like, this is a bit of a different episode, but I think it's very in line with us having a podcast about ADHD to kind of like do things differently each time as we're exploring things. But yeah, so today we've got, I think it's going to be a multi-part because we've got a lot to talk about as we're talking about the show, The Rehearsal, and the way autism is represented and discussed in that show. But I think more importantly, like how it's talked about in pop culture and how we understand it, and like maybe what the show is getting at and the way it reaches people. So yeah, Tara, do you want to talk us through a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today?
Totally. And for some of the folks tuning in, this might be your first like autism show or autism podcast. So I just want to say we're honored. Don't worry, we have all good things to say about Nathan. If you're a fellow Nathan fan, this is not us like laying into him or anything. And this first one is going to help you understand what does non-stereotypical autism look like. And then episode 2 is going to be super technical. So kind of a little bit more of our regular fare, where we are looking at the eyes test. Yes, that one, rehearsal fans, and the validity and shortcomings of that test, and the history of it, and some of the background info about like the fMRI test, and really critically analyzing applications of this stuff.
And another important thing is like why we wanted to do this and why we wanted to share our perspective on it. And I think the way that autism is talked about in the media and in pop culture can often be very biased or skewed. As neurodivergent people with podcasts, we wanted to talk about it from that perspective.
So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating, and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin.
Just to give you guys some background context about what we were talking about, we were talking about The Rehearsal. The Rehearsal is currently the 4th most popular show on HBO, and it's done by a guy named Nathan Fielder. He's a comedian who takes a very acute lens like on the human condition. It is kicking up a storm in media just because particularly that finale is so well done. And it has long attracted opinions from autistic people saying like, hey, this show represents the autistic experience in profound ways. His mother thinks what he does is ethnomethodology, which, and this is like a quote from a magazine article. It's an obscure discipline of sociocultural analysis. Ethnomethodologists attempt to examine society through the study of ordinary people and everyday affairs, in part by designing experiments aimed at disrupting the rules that govern human behavior. And so that's really the crux of what his entire comedy career has been, is putting people in such abnormal situations that you actually get these very insightful moments about people.
It's pushing the boundaries of social norms to test like what people will do, how far they're willing to go, or what boundaries they're willing to break in social norm context. I think why this show does like it resonates with neurodivergent people is oftentimes the rules around social norms don't make sense to us, right? We have to, or we have to understand the context for why a rule is there. We talked about this a little bit. When we have the context, we'll play by the rules, but without it, why are we doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. So normally, it's probably not really good to speculate about like real human beings and real human celebrities. It's a little bit more fair game to talk about characters, right? But without saying this in a spoilery way, the whole premise of some of the last couple episodes invites the question of whether Nathan has autism. And he's created this sort of Schrodinger's cat, like he has Schrodinger's autism, where you're not entirely sure whether he has it or not. And so, because that's the premise of the entire show, I think it's a little bit more fair for us to kind of not diagnose. We're not diagnosticians. I think that we can take moments and discuss why does the autistic community resonate with Nathan? What is so inherently autistic about these things? And like, why are we being like, oh my God, it feels like one of us, right? So there is kind of this concept of like the real human being Nathan, right? And then the other Nathan. It's been fascinating to see some of the comments on like Reddit and stuff based off of these two sort of portrayals, right? Like a direct quote is, I wouldn't even say he has traits in common. The dude is an actor and he's playing a part. The real Nathan is clearly socially aware enough to manipulate people's emotions and perceptions of him in real time. That's difficult for most neurotypical people to do and would be very difficult for someone on the autism spectrum. So basically, yeah, the Reddit argument is that someone autistic couldn't possibly have the self-awareness to create such a poignant work of art examining the human condition because they lack the self-awareness to be able to create something like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, we've talked about this before, right? Like, that's just bonkers. Like, I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The way autism is usually portrayed, or like neurodivergence for that matter, or even ADHD in the media, it can oftentimes be like the butt of a joke. They're making fun of it to show a sense of otherness. It's always like this savant thing where it's like, cannot operate.
It's the two extremes.
Yeah, right. It's like the Rain Man stuff, right? Where it's like, can't operate
Mhm.
normally, but like can drop, hundreds of toothpicks and all of a sudden like be able to calculate them all in an instant kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or like knows, multiple degrees of pi and all this like crazy stuff.
Yeah. Well, so much of the portrayal is like such extremes. Like it's like, oh, these people are like profoundly disabled, and it's that medicalized deficit model and all these things. And then on the flip side, you get the people that are like, autism is my superpower and it's all good.
Right.
It should be nuanced. It can be both. It is both.
Yeah.
It can be disabling. It can give you abilities that other neurotypical people don't have. Both can be true at the same time.
Right.
So there's just so little room for having that nuanced conversation these days. And I hope that that's something that changes. I think this show could go a long way to help change that.
Yeah. And I think this another question this brings up, or I guess like the reason we're talking about it, we're talking about some of the framing earlier on, is like, is it exploitative or is it advocacy? And when you look at it as advocacy, it's changing people's perception around what it looks like in media and in the real world.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I think if he were to come out and say he like actually doesn't have it, I still wouldn't be offended. Like I wouldn't feel like he has exploited autism for personal gain. I would sort of feel like, oh, you're not a sibling, you're a cousin. You understand us well enough to feel like you're part of the family, even if you're not, So
Yeah.
I guess, yeah. So to get into it, like, why do we think that Nathan could be autistic? So in a way, there's kind of almost two questions here, right? Like, is Nathan the character autistic? Is real human being Nathan autistic? And of course, we can't diagnose him from afar, but I think we can use this as a conversation for how autism like actually presents for a lot of people. So to frame this conversation, I feel like we need to talk about stereotypical and non-stereotypical autism. We said this was going to be a spoiler-free episode, and I mean it. Many people have argued that the content in the show is all fake and that it's like a put on, and you can't possibly be like this in real life, right? So we're examining his public interviews instead of moments from the show because I feel like that feels more authentic, actually. He's not trying to further a plot line in these interviews, and there's actually some really incredibly relatable and touching moments in some of these past interviews that he's done.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
again, we're not here to diagnose Nathan Fielder. And I think the reason we're talking about this in the sense of like, does he have autism, is not because we care whether or not he has autism. It's more about how is it being portrayed. This conversation is interesting because it's to the degree that it is relatable,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it's non-stereotypical enough that it has like duped a lot of people into thinking that he couldn't possibly be autistic. So here's a handy graphic from a wonderful site that is run by folks who are both licensed clinical therapists and neurodivergent themselves. So this is a really great site. And they have a lot of really good content about misconceptions and misdiagnoses for neurodivergence. And so what we've done here is we have pulled quotes directly from their site about stereotypical and non-stereotypical autism. And then we have also pulled quotes directly from his interviews to show where things match up. So you can kind of see like why is the autistic community, who is famously good at pattern matching, seeing these points align and being like, wow, this feels like autism. So the first one is repetition and routines serve a sensory function for autistic people. Whether it's a repetitive routine, a ritual, or getting absorbed in an area of interest, these serve the function of blocking out unwanted sensory experiences. For the autistic brain, routines, rituals, familiarity, and interest serve a regulating function in an unpredictable and overstimulating world. Like, that's the plot of the rehearsal. Like, that's the synopsis of the whole conceit of the show, is rehearsing things to help in an unpredictable and overstimulating world. So right
Yeah.
there, that's why we identify with the show. All right, next one. So another quote, this just felt on point. Compensation, which is a method that high masking autistic people use, involves mimicking and copying allistic people. Many people with high masking autistic phenotype observe and catalog phrases and mannerisms from television, movies, or their friends and peers. I, the author, often refer to this process as having a working Google Doc in my head. Whenever I observed someone doing or saying something that I admired, I would mentally catalog it and incorporate it into my own communication style. It was like curating a collection of behaviors and phrases that I could draw from in social situations. Compensation can also manifest in the form of pre-prepared scripts that we rely on during social interaction. I, the author, used to practice conversations and develop scripts in advance. Whenever I knew I would be engaging in a particular conversation, I would rehearse different iterations of that exact conversation in private, ensuring that I had my conversational plugins or scripts ready to go. However, when I found myself in a conversation that deviated from my rehearsed scripts, I would often feel awkward and struggle to cohesively put my words together.
That's interesting. Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, that's the show.
Yeah. Well, just from a personal perspective, Terry, do you ever, how often have you done that? Do you feel like you have to put scripts together before conversations? Or I'm thinking like at work, I'm thinking meetings, I'm thinking presentations.
Yeah, I have to script things all the time. Like, I actually found I can't do PowerPoint presentations, but I am a product manager, and that's my job, is to convince people to implement particular tech solutions for like very complicated software systems. And so it's like, I know my stuff. I know my stuff so well, but I've gotten into so much trouble before because I didn't rehearse how to pitch that stuff to non-autistic people. And they didn't get it because I didn't rehearse how to explain it to people. And so the project got killed. And I'm still pretty bummed about that because it was like a really good idea because I did a lot of work. And so what I do now is I write a script for myself verbatim. Like I write in jokes, I write in pauses, and then the day of, I just read it. And so the skill that I've honed is actually not presentation. It's about reading things with intonation and expressions. So I've just gotten really good at reading.
Yeah, the thing that's relatable about this to me, now I don't have an autism diagnosis, and ADHD and autism are not the same things, but there's a lot of ADHD traits that autism people will experience. There's a lot of autism traits that people with ADHD will experience, and this is one of those things where it's like, I think the reason I struggle more with having stuff too scripted is because of impulsivity, right? I will feel something and I'll react a little bit more impulsively. Now, the problem I have with ADHD is working memory. So I'll practice stuff and I'll forget what I'm going to say or forget what I was trying to say. But I remember when I was working in agencies as a designer, being on client calls, where I wrote out my whole script, what I was going to say, and then sat there like on the call, like reading from a page and just trying to sound natural. I remember my boss looking over at me like disappointed because I was like reading from a script instead of like actually pitching to the client. And so I had to like learn to adapt to that.
Yeah. There's a moment in the show where he chooses to not rehearse before a big moment, and it doesn't go well. And there's so many people online that are like, oh, he intentionally threw as a plot point, like he did this on purpose. Whatever. I'm not going to try and get into whether or not Nathan the human did that on purpose for a TV show. But I think the gist of it is that to an autistic person, seeing the stark difference of how well he can do when things are rehearsed versus how unnatural it can feel when it's not, and how much he can stumble, even though he had binders full of information. He knew his stuff, but he still didn't land the message because he didn't rehearse. That's real life for us. That doesn't feel like an exaggeration for us.
Well, I
Like
think
that happens. That happens to me at work.
I think that's the thing. It's like, again, whether or not it's scripted, what is he trying to say with it? And I think in that moment, it's the contrast. It's to show why he would rehearse something, why people script things, and what happens when you don't. And in that moment, the comedy doesn't come from, it's not him like making a joke of like autistic people can't do things, right? It almost feels like the dangers or the risks of being unprepared, right? And that's the relatable
Well, and I would
thing.
take it a step further. It's the risk of making an autistic person not operate in an autistic friendly way, right?
Yeah,
Like if
right.
you shame an autistic person for rehearsing or for masking or for all these things, masking is tricky, but like rehearsing and stuff, that's a normal autistic trait. And so if you shame someone, if a manager at work gives you feedback, like you should be able to talk off the cuff more, you're setting us up for failure, right? Because it's not that we can't land a pitch ever. It's not that we can't land a message ever. It's that we need to do it using our own methods. And if you disrupt those methods, then you are setting us up for failure.
Right. And I think that even as someone with ADHD, that moment was relatable to me. I've had that moment many times. And just thinking about being set up for failure, that job that I had at the agency where I was like reading from the paper to that client pitch, I lost that job. Like I was fired from that job after 9 months. Not for that singular moment, but it's because of the way my boss reacted to that. And there were multiple moments like that where I felt like I was constantly having to accommodate or change my behavior. And so I never knew what the bar was. I never knew what was expected of me. And it was hard to operate, hard to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just the trait. Masking involves being hyper aware of our body language during conversations. I, the author, used to consciously coach myself on appropriate body movements, reminding myself to nod to show engagement and to uncross my arms to avoid appearing defensive. These intentional body coaching techniques were aimed at conveying interest and engagement in social interactions. This is just a very relatable experience for a lot of autistic people to practice gesturing. Like I remember in high school, I wanted to come off as like a relaxed surfer girl. I lived in Colorado, I didn't surf, but I wanted to seem really chill. And so I'd sit and practice like, how do you stand in a way that makes you look mellow? How do you talk a little slower in a way that seems really mellow? Because that was like what I wanted to portray. And so this is just kind of really common to emulate potentially a particular person or just an archetype of a person, and learn how to gesture more naturally. So
Well, it's just kind of thinking through that, how I've been able to navigate different social groups at different times of my life and in different settings. Like I remember being in high school, I was always a nerd. I always fit in more with the nerdy types, but I was never felt like I was, a jock or a prep or whatever those cliques were. But I had friends in all those groups, and so I remember like a lot of times at lunch or different times or just being able to navigate and go from different social environments before I ever knew what ADHD or masking was. And a lot of that was because I was able to like momentarily fit into those groups because I'm really good at mirroring their behaviors, their emotions, their facial expressions. So they feel comfortable because they're seeing in me the way they are feeling themselves. It's not even intentional
yeah.
for me, right? It's just like it's that skill. It's how I've learned to do that, and I've adapted that behavior. I think on the other side of it though is when you're doing that all day long, that's where some of that burnout comes
Totally.
from.
I mean, when you become a vessel for someone else's emotions and stuff, you lose your sense of self. And so this is kind of getting at like why masking has detrimental health effects, right? Like I also did the same thing in high school. I remember like feeling like I had something wrong with me because in some groups I'd be really shy and quiet, and in some groups I'd be really loud and like joking all the time and really boisterous and stuff. And you don't know who you are because you are just a reflection, and it's not on purpose. It's not in like a manipulative way. That's
Right.
something that I want to land too. Like it's not it's almost an involuntary thing, especially when you're younger, because it's not fully conscious. And so then you're like, who am I? Because you see yourself in all situations, and then you're like, this doesn't feel congruent, you know? But then you can end up having a very disparate group of friends from all different types, but you're like, where do I fit, right?
And we know that neurodivergent people oftentimes attract each other.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about this kind of recently where it's like my hypothesis is like what I think happens is when you start mirroring somebody, you end up in this weird like feedback loop
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, this person is doing what I'm doing. It's sort of like the Spider-Man thing where it's like the spidey sense of tingling. I was like, oh, they're like me. I think you realize that really quickly. And sometimes that can create friction, but sometimes it creates magic,
Mhm.
right? Where it's like, oh, we're the same in some weird unexplainable
I think
way.
we tend to
And then you just
amplify each
click.
other sometimes, and it's sometimes for better
Right.
or for worse. But yeah, we amplify each other, and so I think that's why we tend to attract each other. The speaking habits are also different because it tends to be more info dumping and interest based as opposed to sort of that ping ponging of questions back and forth. You don't parry questions back and forth as much. Some of my best interactions with neurodivergent people, we've talked for 3 hours and not one of us asked each other a question because we just sort of story swap, which can sometimes be misconstrued as being selfish, but it's actually just a different communication habit.
When you can unmask and when you can like openly say like, oh, hey, I have ADHD, or hey, I'm neurodivergent, it becomes so much more magical. The whole tone of the relationship shifts. You immediately start bonding.
Yeah.
And that can be really rewarding. It's hard to do in a workplace. It's hard to do in all settings, which is why the advocacy thing is so important because the more we can normalize saying that and talking about it without stigmatizing, it just means we can be our whole selves in so many more settings.
Totally. So, another quote from that website about high masking autism. Another reason why high masking autistic adults are less likely to be identified is because of our tendency to internalize repetitions. This can manifest as internalized stimming, where we repeat the same sentence or phrase, or engage in internal counting. It may also involve listening to a song on repeat for several hours. In fact, many of us may not even realize that our experience of internalized repetition is unique, often assuming that everyone else engages in similar mental repetitions. Like if you had to summarize autism in one word, it would be like depth. We do things intensely, we do things deeply, and so the degree is what really distinguishes it. And so this isn't like twirling your hair. Sometimes, this is fidgeting or stimming quite a bit more. And so high masking folks, it's not that they don't stim or fidget, it's that we have found ways to do it in public that don't draw attention. Like, I've actually seen a lot of autistic people, I don't do this, a lot of people online fidget with their toes in their shoes because they learned that no one can see that. It may be more ruminative thoughts.
While we're talking about fidgeting, it's interesting because like I have a million things I fidget with. For one of them, like is this like curly headphone cord that is really fun. I keep stuff on my desk to fidget with, so I have this like weird little ball. This one I can do quietly sometimes. It's like a little like cube thing that's fun. Over here is this. It's this like putty that's fun to like play around with. So I have all of it. This is like
That Aaron's thinking
it
putty.
is, yeah. So I have a whole
Yeah.
collection of this stuff.
Good
So yeah,
stuff.
so I keep things within reach to fidget with.
Yeah. And, I just want to say neurotypicals or allistic people, so non-autistic people, do fidget. And something that you're going to see in the common theme of like autistic traits is that these are things that everybody does, but the thing that makes it autistic is the degree to which we do them.
Right.
So the next one from this article is autistic people tend to have more difficulty in developing a cohesive narrative around our identity and emotions. We also tend to have more difficulty talking about our emotions. In the Vulture quote, Fielder's colleagues have described him as a genius in the edit room, a master at pulling narratives out of countless hours of incoherent footage, but he's less confident when it comes to telling his own story. I had already heard the following speech several times with slight variations. I think you can build a story for yourself and retroactively say, well, that was probably this. You're looking for the logical connections. It's nice to tell a story that way, but I don't know if that's always what's happening. He fiddled with his chopsticks, drawing them in his fingers. I don't know, maybe. So like he's just not confident about the truth in his own story, which is exactly what we've been talking about. So in this interview, the guy goes, I asked if he had talked about our interview with his therapist. He hesitated and goes, fuck. His voice dropped to a low murmur. I wanted to just lie right now. He began to explain himself. He did not specifically schedule a session with her after speaking with me. He just happened to have one scheduled. Why am I telling you this shit? He said, laughing in disbelief. He was growing uncharacteristically animated. I should have just lied to you just now, he said, but I know that if I lied in that moment, I would have been caught. So, the interviewer asked this really simple question, like, oh, did you talk to your therapist about this interview? And he just like launches into this whole backstory, and he's like, worried, is the interviewer going to be offended? And like, he's like explaining himself, and he's like, and I couldn't lie. And, like there's so much context. And so neurodivergent people tend to share a lot of context when we communicate. We don't just share the fact, we share the info about the fact. And that can sometimes make neurotypicals tune us out or get kind of lost in the sauce and like not understand us. And that's challenging because they're not trying to do that on purpose, but we're also not trying to do that on purpose. And so like, how do you meet in the middle? And so like for work, for example, I type out all my thoughts and then I go back and I have to delete a bunch of shit that I was like, this is relevant. And then I have to go like, Tara, is it really relevant? Like, what's your goal? Does this accomplish your goal? And so I have to edit to be heard in the workplace, because otherwise no one will hear me, no one will listen, no one will take my stuff seriously. And it feels counterintuitive to get more respect by deleting what I think is relevant information.
It's tough, especially like in live conversation. It's something that I've struggled with and gotten a lot of feedback on, because like I don't know how not to do it. I don't know how not to like.
It's so much harder when it's live.
Yeah, it's like I have to explain my entire process for how I got to the thing I'm about to tell you. It's tough, and you're right. Like writing things out helps.
Yeah. So the autism trait, our brains excel when exploring areas of interest. Due to the hyperconnectivity of certain parts of the brain, we become passionately interested in our interests and derive a great deal of pleasure, motivation, and energy from those areas of interest. Our interests are often integrated into our sense of self and our identity. When autistic people begin speaking about our interests, we often become emotionally animated and our verbal fluency increases. Additionally, we may have developed exceptional skills within an area of interest. So I tend to emote more on this podcast because I care about this subject matter more so than if I'm talking at work with people. Well, I get passionate at work too. I don't know. That's a bad example. But anyway, the quote from Rolling Stone is, the scariest thing about the show is that the character is Nathan, says Tim Gilbert, Fielder's college roommate and a fellow comedian. It's not super put on. When we were 22-year-old stand-up comedian degenerates wanting to do sets and then get drunk, Nathan would be at home editing his own videos and learning Final Cut. So, you know, making comedy and videos sounds like it was sort of more of a special interest to him, to the extent that that gave him more pleasure and was the preferred activity over like getting drunk and socializing and stuff, and from the perspective of his college roommate. So
And I think every human gets more animated whenever they're talking about something they're interested in and they're passionate about. I think the difference here is that while every human gets animated and passionate and can talk more about things they're interested in, when they're talking about things they're not interested in, they can also be similarly animated. And I think that with autism is that goes from like being more work or some of that flat affectation to becoming what others might perceive as a different person or a different persona when you're talking about something you're interested in. And it's that shift because it breaks the way people expect an autistic person to behave.
yeah, and so it's interesting to me when I see people comment like, "Oh, I've seen an interview where he emotes more, or his voice changes more." It's like, it doesn't mean you're like not capable. Like you're not like missing vocal cords or like
Yeah.
facial muscles. It's just that it takes work, and so that's not necessarily your resting state. So there's such a wide range, and I've been accused even in high school of like acting before, and that was a huge blow to like my sort of sense of self. People were like, "Oh, you get really good scores on math tests, but you act like a dumb blonde." And I remember saying like, it's just easier for my brain to do that.
That's
But it
so
wasn't an act, and that was like
so
so
unfortunate.
hard to grapple with because I was like, I don't know who I am. Am I dumb? Am I faking it? Like, why? Um, and I couldn't figure it out.
And it's that kind of thing that I think adds to the trauma, right? When you hear your behavior being described inconsistently to how you feel like you're behaving, right? I think this is
And it's acting, it's being deceptive.
they're just, they're just trying to fit in, or they're like doing what they think they should be doing. Or this is like something with ADHD I hear that can be a source of trauma. Like you're being too
Mhm.
much. You're too much, right? And it's like when you're talking about something I'm interested in, I'm gonna get excited and passionate, and we're gonna interrupt each other a lot. And I'm sorry for that, but like, I'm sorry if that's like too much, but that's just, that's how I am.
Totally. Okay. While it's true that everyone has things that they enjoy, autistic people often display an unparalleled level of passion and immersion in our specific areas of interest. So it's this exceptional intensity and profound engagement that distinguishes autistic special interests from ordinary hobbies or interests. So when distinguishing between autistic special interests and hobbies, it's important to consider the intensity rather than the content of the interest itself. Autistic people often create an ecosystem around our special interests. They become the lens through which you process the world, and they are immersive. So this part is super interesting to me, like kind of going into his background with magic. So from the Vulture article, Nathan and his friends joined the Vancouver Magic Circle, the only kids in a sea of old men. He got a job at a magic store in the mall, carried a deck of cards around with him at all times, and started performing at children's birthday parties. At 13, he transferred to a large public school, which was a bewildering experience. He says, "I didn't understand how people made friends. Performing magic, he soon discovered, was easier than conjuring small talk. You're saying, here's what we're going to engage about, and then when the trick is done, the interaction ends." And so for him, the magic was a way to sort of gain control over like an unpredictable social situation where you'd have to come up with small talk. And so it gave him a special interest, a point of discussion where he felt prepared. And then the interaction would safely end after the magic trick ended. So that was his way of making friends when he was 13.
Well, it's creating common ground, and it's putting him in a place where he can control the outcome and he can control the engagement.
Which is why we tend to steer conversations towards our special interests. It's not that we're trying to be self-centered and talk about only what we want to talk about. It's because we are processing the content of the confirmation using the special interest as like a lens or a tool. What we know about real life, real human Nathan is that he has committed deeply to bits before. On Nathan For You, he spent 9 months teaching himself how to tightrope walk rather than get a stunt double for this one bit in an episode where he could have just had a stunt double, but he was like, there's no way around it. I just need to teach myself how to tightrope walk. So it was like an incredibly dangerous thing. And he just immersed himself for one single joke. So tightrope walking in and of itself is not autistic. Completely immersing yourself like that maybe feels a little more autistic, as well as just like the special interests. So the second season of the rehearsal pertains to commercial aviation crashes and how you could prevent that. So in a recent Vulture interview that he did, he said he's been interested in commercial aviation crashes for around 20 years. This is not new for him. He's been watching footage of commercial aviation crashes and reading the manuscripts and stuff like that for 20 years. And so, like, a lot of people were like, oh, he's just scratching the surface on some of these problems. I'm like, I have no doubt that he has sat and researched this longer and more deeply than potentially a lot of people, other people who like have this as a career path, right? That's kind of what a special interest looks like, is it can be lifelong. So the intensity with which he pursues this interest is perhaps a little less neurotypical.
Yeah, that one's interesting. And then like what makes that relatable? Like people with ADHD do this. Like I can get really deep into things. I can like learn a whole new skill in a weekend. So I have a lot of divergent interests that are like completely unrelated. I'll be interested in something and I'll super hyper focus, deep dive on it for a while, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Part of the reason I bounce around a little bit is like I'll learn enough. I'll learn the thing I needed to learn, and then I'll move on to the next thing that I'm interested in. Or sometimes it's just burnout. Like I'll get really deep into something and I'll just get sick of it, right? Do you do that? Do you stick with things for a while, or how do you manage burnout?
I have both. So because I have both ADHD and autism, with ADHD we call them hyperfixations. With autism we call them like special interests, because they're both equally like intense. The difference is kind of the duration. So ADHD hyperfixations tend to be more transient. Like you get them, you satiate, you burn out, you move on. With autistic special interests, they kind of are with you for years and years and years, if not life. And I tend to burn out less on special interests just because I would say if an ADHD hyperfixation is like an 11, my special interest is a 10. Like it's still intense. With ADHD hyperfixations, you forget to eat and drink and stuff, and so your body like forces you to stop at a certain point. And this can still be true with autistic special interests, but I would say special interests feel ever so slightly more sustainable to me. Like I've kind of had a lifelong special interest in Disney, which as a kid, everybody's like, oh, a little girl who likes princesses. But that was not the case. I actually don't really like the princesses. I like the theme parks and all of the things that pertain to it. So, for example, a way that the Disney thing has manifested for me as an adult is that my bathroom is themed after the Jungle Cruise ride. And so I sat and I watched YouTube videos of like, what does the queue look like? What type of objects would you have? And things that bug me are the fact that like the countertop is like a quartz countertop. And I'm like, that's not accurate to the line, but I can't rip out my countertops for accuracy. So that's what a special interest looks like. Hear about the immersion.
I don't know how we haven't talked about this. This is like another thing for us to bond over, but I don't know how we haven't talked about this Disney thing, because like I've been to Disneyland twice in the past month, which is fun. I have kids now, so I go with the kids. But like I was a Disney
Well,
nerd.
and let's talk about real quick, why do neurodivergent people tend to have particular special interests? As much as we're saying it can be on anything, to be honest, there are tendencies for us to cluster around certain topics. And frankly, I think it's anything that has a lot of lore, a lot of depth to it. And so, something that Disney does very well is there's a whole industry around the lore of Disney. There are people whose entire podcasts are about the history of the creation of the park and the little details that they put into like the rides. And so there's just endless amounts of content to sink your teeth into. So another atypical thing that I did growing up that should have been an autism flag, again, wasn't watching princess videos. They used to send you this DVD drive about I think they had like 23 hotels. And you would put in your DVD player, and it would show you footage from all our different hotels. And they have the value, the mid-tier ones, and the luxury ones and stuff. And I would just sit and watch that video about the hotels, and I would memorize facts about the Disney World hotels. And so that's not so neurotypical. I was in 5th grade, so I was 13. But again, if you go talk to someone's teacher, a doctor, or, oh, my kid's obsessed with Disney, they're like, every kid's obsessed with Disney.
Right.
But not every kid is memorizing facts about hotels.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to keep talking about this. We're gonna have to do an episode. There's so much to talk about here. This is impulsivity. This is impulsivity at play. Because this is exciting to me and it's passionate about.
And the tingles of your
I know, yeah.
special interest.
Totally.
Right?
I could talk about the Disney stuff for a while, all the Imagineering stuff, experience of the park. Yeah, okay. Let's bring it back.
When your special interest is calling, you're drawn to it, right? That's like a very neurodivergent trait, which is something that Nathan exhibits as well.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think
I guess that's it. Okay.
Well, I was gonna say, I think the other point here too is how does it manifest in your life, and at what point does it interfere with the thing that you're supposed to be doing,
Mhm.
right? Especially if it's like something that puts you at odds with others because of stigma or something.
Mhm. All right. So the next one, autistic people who mask have often adapted to the stress and trauma of not fitting in by becoming exceptional people pleasers. Another way to consider this is through the body's stress response. Many of us have adapted by engaging the fawn response and attempting to appease those around us so that we don't stand out. This is yet another way that high masking autistic people have internalized the stress of being autistic. We've taken external stress and turned it inward. Our bodies suffer, but we look calm to the outside observer. So when he presented his videos at the Laugh Sabbath weekly show, which is a comedy show in Toronto, he noticed that people often laughed at aspects of the work he hadn't intended to be funny, his voice, his facial expressions, and he said it felt freeing. There was a transition where I went from trying to hide the embarrassing parts to appreciating the things about myself that I hated before. And so he talks about like when he can drop the mask a little, how freeing it feels.
It's finding a energy and finding a place where you can feel a little bit accepted, or the things that he was embarrassed about, he ends up appreciating because he's able to channel it in a positive way.
Absolutely. One of the primary reasons high masking autistic people don't get identified is that many of us have adapted to our social differences by becoming studious observers of people. Many of us have become keen observers of social cues, studying how people move, talk, and interact. This may stem from our innate social motivation or through social conditioning. As a result, many of us have honed sophisticated strategies to socially blend in. These strategies can include suppressing or hiding stimming behaviors, meticulously studying and imitating social behaviors, analyzing body language, scripting and rehearsing conversations, and displaying excessive accommodation and helpfulness towards others. So, again, in this Rolling Stone interview, it's 11 a.m. on a Monday, and Fielder is sitting at the V Boulevard Cafe, a short drive from his production office in Glendale, California. Unlike on his show, conversation flows with relative ease, but that doesn't mean that things don't sometimes get a little strange. When a server comes to take our order, he looks genuinely panicked when I ask for a turkey sandwich. Will you be offended if I get a breakfast thing? He asks with unblinking stone-faced sincerity. Should I match you? He eventually felt comfortable enough to go for oatmeal, but the question of just how weird this guy really is and how much his TV persona matches his real self lingers. So he was trying to accommodate this interviewer to the extent that he thought that the interviewer would be offended if he ordered oatmeal and didn't also get a lunchtime thing. And you can see that he's explicitly asking, should I match you? Should I mirror you? Or would it offend you if I didn't? And so I would say that is overly accommodating. And it shows he's like a very sweet guy, right? He's incredibly concerned with like the way that this interviewer not only perceives him, but like I would argue the way that interviewer perceives him is priority number 2. Priority number 1 is the interviewer feels comfortable around him.
Yeah, and that the other person not only is comfortable, but is comfortable with his behavior and his differences.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I thought that the interesting bit was like, oh, the conversation flows naturally we learn how to make conversation flow naturally. We become keen observers of social cues. We study all these things. We become quite good at it. So it's not that we like can't get to the point where you can have like a natural free flowing conversation. So to me, the real tell is not that he's awkward to talk to, but that he's so accommodating, and that is not necessarily exclusive of autism. I know people are going to say, oh, that can be a survival mechanism if you have like childhood trauma or PTSD or anything. But again, none of these things in isolation are autism. It's the pattern. It's the constellation together paints a picture.
Right.
So another one that they talk about is due to their difficulty socially blending in, autistic people with more stereotypical presentations may face a higher degree of bullying, teasing, and negative reactions from peers. This can lead to feelings of isolation and contribute to mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety, which anxiety is something that he has talked about quite a bit. People with stereotypical presentations of autism often also experience more severe alexithymia, which refers to the difficulty of identifying and describing emotions. The presence of alexithymia intensifies social difficulties and makes it even more challenging to understand and perceive shifts in emotional tone, contributing to a dysregulating and anxiety-provoking social experience. And so I think when he was younger may have been a more stereotypical presentation and then developed a mask based on the stereotypical presentation. Oh, and alexithymia is the inability to connect your physical sensations with your emotional state. So you might be upset, but you might not clock it in the moment. Like you might be like, my throat hurts, my stomach hurts. But you aren't necessarily registering, I am upset in the moment. Like it can vary a little bit day to day. So this quote from Seth Rogen, who he went to high school with. So in high school, he joined the improv team where he grew closer to Rogen. To the untrained eye, you would not understand that he has a sense of humor. You would maybe think that he was just weird. I started to realize that it was partially deliberate how weird he was. It's your classic case of taking ownership of the thing that could be your worst trait. Rogen recalls Fielder as a daring improv teammate. He would take big swings, he says. I remember thinking Nathan's going to do something. It's either going to be great or people are really going to be confused by it. So this improv almost feels like a testing ground to develop your sort of mask persona. And that almost shields you from the judgment. And like we mentioned, that judgment can lead to isolation, depression, anxiety. Unfortunately, like self-harm rates are incredibly high for autistic youth and autistic adults. And so that's almost like a shielding mechanism to sort of play into this idea when people are thinking it's deliberate.
Well, it's the idea like he has to mask, and so he's using that mask, and then it becomes less of like a judgment of it and more like, yeah, that was intentional, right? So it becomes reinforcing, sort of like that, I'll reject you before you reject me thing.
Yeah, you're taking ownership of what people say
Right.
about you by giving them something to talk about.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Next one. Building and maintaining peer relationships can be difficult for many autistic people, especially during childhood and adolescence. High maskers become professional chameleons and learn how to adapt and blend in. Although this adaptive strategy helps us socially to blend in, it comes at a significant cost: the development of a distinct social identity. Many high maskers find their sense of self shaped by external influences, leading to a diffuse sense of self or pervasive feeling of emptiness. And the article goes on to even talk about how we can sometimes be misdiagnosed with personality disorders because our sense of self feels so transient. And I think that this is a crucial autistic trait that outside observers, when they say that this isn't a portrayal of autism, are missing. There's this long track record of him talking about how he doesn't have this strong sense of self. So to get into that, it says in the article, Fielder has long said his TV character is based on his teenage self. Back then, the harder he tried to be cool, the worse things seemed to get. For a time, I tried to emulate more confident friends, he says, even wearing a backwards baseball cap. I don't want to dwell on this one too long because there's way more to it than just like dressing the way that his more confident friends dressed. So quickly, I wanted to play a little video that, as best I can tell, this is the most real presentation that Nathan has ever had in an interview. And so this one is with his camp counselor. And I think it sounds like this guy was also like went to his old high school and was a couple years older than him. So we'll just share that real quick.
Then Friday, here at the Hyatt, you were Comedy Newcomer of the Year.
Right.
Or Breakout Star.
Right.
Which one was it?
I think, I don't know.
It's one of the two.
I don't know. Yeah.
You excited for that? Is that fun?
Very honored.
Yeah.
Very excited. Yeah, I mean, that's cool, right? Because the other people that are getting awards are, very reputable people.
It's a good list to be a part of, eh?
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's cool. Yes, it's very cool, and I think that'll be fun.
Yeah. You got Bill Burr, Andy Samberg, and of course Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg,
right.
Directors of the Year. I also went to Point Grey.
Yes.
How cool is that? The three of you guys, Point Grey, in that room on Friday. That is kind of neat.
Yeah. Do you want me to plug the high school or something?
Yeah, plug the high school. Why not? Let's plug the high school.
Really great teachers, really good education. I remember they had these very affordable hash browns in the cafeteria that you could get for breakfast.
Good cookies. You like the cookies?
Yeah. Good cookies. Overall, and the teachers don't do anything inappropriate. Never did. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So you can kind of see from that video, just the way that he talks about his high school experience with Seth Rogen, right? This is kind of how he talks.
Kind of how, it's very, very matter of fact.
Yeah, like he's getting this huge award, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm excited."
Right. Yeah. It's like if that's just how he is, it seems like that's just how he is. Like, there's probably less of a line between the character and who he is, and I think people are drawing.
Yeah. Okay. So another quote from that website about high masking autism. Perhaps one of the most common reasons non-stereotypical presenters of autism are doubted is due to their heightened empathy, which stands in stark contradiction to autism stereotypes. While traditional research linked autism with hypoempathy, recent studies suggest that this is better attributed to alexithymia rather than autism itself. But for Nathan, the quote from this Rolling Stones article is, "There's only about a 10% difference between the Nathan on the show and real life Nathan," says the Nathan For You co-creator Michael Coleman. The character is just an amplified version of him. He's awkward socially. Most people in comedy are awkward socially, but he's a guy with a very solid, wonderful group of friends who is a loyal, ethical person. He's a very sweet man, and he's very concerned with your well-being. So to me, that kind of feels like hyperempathy because he cares. They specifically use the words ethical. They use the words loyal. That can be fully in line with autism, unlike what we see in the media, because autism researchers have carelessly used this term empathy to say that we have deficits, when what they mean is cognitive empathy, the ability to see an emotion and name it in another person. But we do not generally have deficits with affective empathy, with feeling someone else's feelings. And in fact, there are kind of new theories that the true marker of autism is sort of an imbalance between the cognitive empathy and the affective empathy, and not so much that it's just a pure deficit in cognitive empathy. So for me, like, I'm pretty high in cognitive empathy. I score pretty high on these tests, but I am like through the charts on affective empathy. Like, I feel physically uncomfortable if I see someone kill a bug, because I sort of experienced that sensation of like the moments that you would feel before you die. It's almost hyper empathy to the point of being debilitating at times, but that's autism.
Yeah.
At his house, Fielder introduced me to his cats, Jackie and Rocket, who trailed us into the kitchen and jumped onto the table. When I got them, they were kittens, he said. They were like 10 brothers and sisters grouped together, all cuddling, and then one off to the side. Jackie was the outcast, and I was like, I want her. And I don't know, I just thought that was really cute, and I wanted to share that.
It's charming. Yeah. It's charming. It's like It's very
Yeah,
humanizing.
totally. And so I think that's something that people really aren't clocking with Nathan, is that he can be empathetic and caring, and actually by absorbing the emotions of someone in the room with him, that gives him an incredibly powerful insight into the people that he's doing these scenes with. And like the fact that they feel uncomfortable, he might not just pick up on that. He might be like feeling that himself. And so he's hyper aware because he's hyper empathetic. That's the thing for us. But then we can also use that hyper empathy to actually have a more sensitive gauge. I think that would be an incredibly powerful tool as a comedian who's doing this sort of nuanced like discomfort work, like where you're dealing with like people feeling uncomfortable and making them uncomfortable. He may have stronger gauges and better tooling than a neurotypical because of that hyper empathy. So actually he may be better equipped than a neurotypical to do that type of comedy work.
Well, he's reading the room, right? He's reading the room and he's getting a
He's
gauge.
not reading the room. He's feeling the room.
Right.
That's the key difference. Is if you're autistic, you might not be able to read the room, but many of us can physically feel the room. And so that makes it easier to respond to it.
Right. And so I think that plays into then his portrayal or his performance in really subtle or funny or relatable ways.
Yeah. All right, so the next one, many of us have difficulty identifying our emotions until they reach a heightened level, which complicates our ability to recognize and regulate our emotions. So, the quote from the article, one day around the time of his divorce, he broke down in the middle of a big meeting. Losing control of his emotions, he said, was a very jarring experience. He began seeing a therapist just before his marriage ended and discovered it was physically difficult for him to talk about his feelings. I had a pain in my chest, he said. I still get that, but not as much. He was dating someone now, and they'd recently moved in together. It's not always easy to let a person in like that, he said. It's been really nice. He was silent for a long moment. I'm like really happy. Saying things out loud to his therapist that he had never said before had helped. I've shared everything with her, he said, and it's been fine. And so this is a really common autistic thing. Like you don't necessarily identify your own emotions when you're at a level like 2 or 3. You kind of only notice them sometimes when it's like an 8 or a 9. And then that's why sometimes they boil over, is because you didn't notice that ramp up period. And so that kind of sounds like that's what happened with his divorce, where he didn't notice and then it all came out.
I think a couple important points there. One, the value of therapy, to have a place to talk about things, to explore conflicts yourself, have some strategies to work through things. I think therapy can be really helpful to work through a lot of that trauma. But I think overall, the kind of glue for the whole series was communication.
Yeah.
Because I think the thing that is hard for neurodivergent people is how we relate to others, how we communicate to other people, how we are expressing ourselves. And that's what leads to so much of the trauma, so much of the tension with others, so much of that miscommunication and the conflict comes from our inability to communicate what we're feeling. When you're talking to somebody who understands what you're going through, you can start to develop a shorthand or a way to frame things that requires less work, especially in a relationship, right? Where you can have a communication style that takes into account your inability to communicate sometimes. And that, I think, is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, how do you communicate effectively, knowing that communication is so important in a world where you are already born speaking a slightly different language,
Right. When you look at the show through that lens, it kind of delivers on that too, right? It's like, here's how to communicate, even when you know that communicating is going to be hard or not going to happen.
Yeah.
Consistently. Right?
Yeah. Well, and I'll note this article came out before the rehearsal. So it kind of feels like he was maybe ruminating a little bit on this concept, and this could have even influenced the rehearsal. So, and this one's super important because everybody's saying, how could he conceive of a show like this if he's autistic? Many high-masking autistic people have a thinking style that is deeply existential, theoretical, and metaphorical. We can be highly engaged with existential concepts and thoughts. Interestingly, this tendency appears to be more common among the non-stereotypical autistic presenters. Many of us have a special interest in spirituality, philosophy, existentialism, or humanitarianism, and we often find ourselves contemplating the nature of existence. So not only is it possible for an autistic person to come up with a show, it's actually quite likely that an autistic person could come up with a show like this. So the corresponding quote, "There's a real Milgram quality to Nathan," said the actor and comedian H. John Benjamin, who is the voice of Bob from Bob's Burgers or Archer from Archer. He's referring to Stanley Milgram, the eccentric and visionary psychologist known for a notorious study of obedience that began in 1961, in which he lured subjects into administering what they believed were electric shocks to other participants. "It always seemed like Nathan was from another planet learning how to do human customs," Benjamin told me, or AI collecting information on human behavior.
That sort of reminds me of I was thinking about this as we think about portrayals of autism in pop culture. I'm a big Star Trek nerd, and I think that a lot of neurodivergent people like Star Trek because without it ever talking about neurodivergence at all, I feel like there's a lot of portrayals of neurodivergent behavior.
Yeah.
Just it feels very relatable in Star Trek, from Spock to Data to Worf to a lot of the way they handle things feels like, again, without diagnosing any of them, it feels like portrayals of ADHD and neurodivergence. So it's piece collecting human behavior reminded me of Data, right? And Spock, which are two of my favorite characters that I always related to more than anybody else, just because of the way they always seemed different and wanted to get all the facts.
Well, I feel like my brain feels like a machine learning algorithm sometimes, and I don't know a better way to explain it. Not to say that I'm robotic, right? But when I first start projects at work, I really, really struggle because I have a bottom-up thinking style, which is very standard for an autistic person where you need all the data points. And so at first, for the first month, I'm worthless. I don't know. I don't have any opinions. And I think managers tend to get concerned because I take longer to ramp up. But when I learn all of the background context, I'm able to see the whole system in a more holistic way than many coworkers and stuff. It does kind of feel like machine learning, right? Where it's I need a bunch of training data, and then I will pick up on patterns that you don't see. But I need the training data first, or else I can't do much. The next one, autistic people tend to have a distinct cognitive style when it comes to processing information. Known as bottom-up thinking, this approach involves starting with specific details or observations and gradually constructing a larger understanding or general conclusion. By analyzing individual components and synthesizing them, we form deep comprehension of the subject. Bottom-up thinking is characterized by its data-driven and evidence-based reasoning, but it also requires significant cognitive energy. So I'd say arguably this is the entire design of the show, and I think that it would be hard for a top-down thinker to even create this plot line. That's why people are how did he come up with it? It's bottom-up thinking, right? But another specific quote about this. So again, one of his colleagues on the show, H. John Benjamin, found him to be endearing and odd. When we'd go out to eat and everyone would order and then the waiter would come to him and he would stall, he recalled, he would ask about every dish. He would ask, what are the ingredients? I remember him asking about chicken teriyaki for 3 minutes. What's in it? What's in the sauce? Do you like it? To the point where the server was I don't have time for this. The assumption, I think, was that it was a joke and it was the most entertaining thing to watch. But he was not joking. He could not order. It was like he'd spent 6 years alone in his room doing magic and was now wandering around like a foreigner in this world. So.
Yeah. It's that's that kind of thing that I think could be portrayed or could be perceived as pedantic or annoying.
Yeah.
But it's just data gathering, right?
He needed enough data to be able to know what to order. He wasn't able to make that top-down choice in the absence of all this information.
Right.
Yeah. All right, then my last quote for you guys. As of 2017, Nathan didn't believe that he has autism. So in that article, it says that Fielder researched Asperger's syndrome, which is kind of the outdated term for autism, while fine-tuning his TV persona, but he rejects any suggestion his character is on the spectrum. He says there's a lot of social disconnects that people experience all the time that have nothing to do with autism or anything. He says, when I asked if he's ever wondered whether he has a developmental disorder, he's genuinely horrified. Please don't tell me this is the angle of your piece. So obviously, his perspective has changed quite a bit since 2017 when he was still doing Nathan For You. So he was like, I'm not autistic, the character's not autistic. And it's evolved to the point in 2025 that in the rehearsal, that's now a prominent plot line, is whether he, the character, or he, Nathan himself, is autistic. And so that's kind of one of those things that I'm asking folks, don't think we're autistic until we do. And that's a topic that we actually cover in our diagnostic ladder video. And that's something like I personally, if you would have asked me, 5 years ago, do you think you're autistic? I would have been like, that's ridiculous. I even had friends, ask that who knew I had ADHD. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I have ADHD. That's opposite of autism. And I didn't realize ADHD is not opposite of autism.
Right. Right. Yeah, a lot of similarities. In fact, I think the conversation has shifted a lot since 2017, and I think we've learned so much and talk about it so differently now than we did back then.
And I think that's something that's so cool about this show is that I think it's one of the only shows that shows that progress, like the way that you sort of reject it at first, because I think that's really common. Like if somebody else tries to say that to
Yeah.
you, you're like, absolutely not. And like it can even be like offensive at first, because frankly, people do get offended when you ask if they're autistic because it's still seen as like a bad thing.
Right. Well, and I think also it depends on who's asking the question and where it's coming from. I think because there's so much stigma around it, and especially there has been in the past, a lot more in the past, and still today, when you see autistic behavior modeled positively, then it becomes much easier to identify with that and to understand, to see like, oh, it's this other thing than I thought it was. I think that's what the show is trying to do and gets at it, because it gets to that point where once it starts asking the question, it starts to model autistic behavior in a positive way, which I think is it's interesting. I think that's like kind of what makes it work.
Yeah, and I think you captured something really important here is that the question shifts from being an external one to being an internal
Right.
one. And that's kind of when you generally start on that journey, is when it starts to come from within. Like, am I
Right.
autistic, ADHD, whatever? Like, that's the beginning, really. So to land the plane on this first segment, do we think Nathan has autism? And I am going to argue it kind of doesn't matter. And is this a portrayal of autism? Like, emphatically, yes.
Right.
I feel like that's an easy one.
It's clear that he's obviously on his own journey where he's learning and working it in, which is good. It shows growth, right?
Well, and there's something I want to briefly call out to people online are kind of acting like, hey, it's so offensive to compare him to being autistic. And I totally understand the argument for like your average actor, your average person. We're not trying to like dox his brain, right? But the series itself set it up in a way where it invites you to have that conversation. Like he invited the question with the series. So, and honestly, it has occurred to me that I should email him that we are making this podcast and tell him, if you want us to take it down, we will take it down. But imagine the flip side. Imagine that this is actually how he is. And everyone in the world is saying, what a weirdo. It's just an act. And it's not. Like, imagine the inverse. What must that do to his personality and his sense of self if everybody's like, it's too much, it's an act, he's a weird, like, that's too weird, and it's just him. And even if it is just an act for him, what about for the people who like are like this?
He never makes it out like it's a bad thing. At no point is he ever seen like alarmed or worried or scared, or does his comedy have to do with the awkwardness of having autism. I think it has to do more with discovering autistic traits and autistic behaviors, because a lot of the show is about, can we change behavior? And a lot of that has to do with masking, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at it from that angle, the way he talks about what autistic people can do and the way he's portraying it never feels like it's coming from a place of things autistic people can't do. It feels just the opposite. It sort of feels like he's saying, without ever saying he's autistic, it sort of feels like he's showing the audience, but I'm autistic and I can do all of these things. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah. Yeah. So even if he's not one of us, he understands us deeply enough to create art that like really beautifully articulates our thought patterns, and it speaks to us in a way that doesn't feel stereotypical or exploitative. So that's fine with me. He's made it a discussion point of the show, which I think is an incredible thing. I don't know that I've seen a lot of portrayals in this way because it makes the audience experience the question in the same way a late diagnosed person will be constantly asking themselves this question when they start to realize I might be autistic. It starts to pop up everywhere, and you're like, is this a pattern? Is this a thing? Does everybody do this? Is it all in my head? And when you rewatch it with the context from the finale, it completely recontextualizes a lot of the scenes from the show. And I think that very much parallels, whether or not this was intentional on his part, I don't know. The same way the diagnosis will sort of recontextualize your memories and the challenges that you've had. So he not only shows autistic thinking patterns, but almost makes you, as the audience, experience the part where you're wondering if you're autistic. And he's offered up his own life as sort of a tool to start the conversation. And he's just created art that I think is an absolute gift. And so I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether or not he is really autistic, because what he has created is so profound and impactful for us that I'm just grateful either way.
Again, that's
Because sometimes the like autism advocacy is like over the top, where it's like, we're saving these children from themselves. And like, he's not like trying
Right.
to rescue us. Like, because that's also just like, ugh. It's not, it's not a fatal disease. Like, people are so freaking dramatic about autism sometimes, and we see that in American politics today, even,
Yep.
right? And it's not to discount the challenges. I understand that I come from a place of privilege because I have developed the ability to mask highly. And while that is a personal tax on me, and it is dangerous to mask 24/7 because it can lead to burnout, it can lead to depression, it can lead to self-harm. It is still a skill. And of course, I use that. I use that at work. I use that, like I said, even to have this podcast, right? But like, people are so dramatic where they act like autism must be cured because it's like deadly, right? Like with the vaccine advocacy, which we will talk about that more in part 2 of this episode because there's a lot more to talk about with that. But that is obnoxious too when people are like, but we're helping. It's like, you're not. You're not.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It feels especially relatable to people who have gone on a diagnosis journey or that questioning journey, right? I also watch like a lot of travel shows, like food shows, and the way he was handling it sort of feels like a travel food show where the host of the show might be trying like a dish from somewhere, and they're trying to describe their experience of what that dish tastes like over television.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like that, where it's like he's sort of acting as the host and the guide for an experience I think many of us can relate to. And
I think the key point is that some of us have tasted this dish and some of us have not.
Right.
And so the people that are
Right.
commenting who haven't tasted the dish just might not be able to relate in quite the same way that those of us that have tasted it are going to experience the show.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this part 1. Part 2, we'll have all the spoilers. We're going to really get into the subject matter, including the office visits, the experts that he brings in, and we have all the details, all the history, a ton of really interesting information about that eye test. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and if you made it this far, give us a like, give us a subscribe. Thank you, Tara, for writing the notes for this.
Thank you for jumping into my Unhinged. It got up to 18 pages.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening. Awesome.